Hello, I'm Ed Ludwig on behalf of the Doylestown Historical Society. The Society is extremely pleased to present a video history, George B. Bishop on Doylestown since 1910, the evolution of a wonderful small town, as interviewed by Vicki Azar. The filming was done by Michelle and Chris Powell of Television Incorporated, and I think you'll agree they've put together a very artistic and interesting production. Some of the photographs were made available by Milt Rutherford. The filming was done here at Aldie Manor on June 15, 1998, just outside of Doylestown Borough. The Doylestown Historical Society, if I may digress for just a moment, is a part of the government of Doylestown Borough, and it is operated in the public interest. The Society's purpose, or mission, if you will, is to preserve the history of Doylestown's persons, places, and events so that they may be long remembered. And George Bishop has a tremendous recollection of Doylestown, and everyone who cares about our great community will enjoy hearing and seeing this warm autobiographical account. This video history, or living history you might say, follows 4 others that have been shown by the Society. The first, in September of 1995, was an evening with W. Lester Trout, and 2 months later, Herman Silverman on his 50-year friendship with Jim Michener. In June of 1996, there was Dorothy Heyman Redfield on Doylestown since the early 1900s. And then in September of 1996, from Austin, Texas, Jim Michener looking homeward to Doylestown. In June of 1996, the Society also sponsored the historical marker that was given by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission to commemorate the world-renowned anthropologist Margaret Mead. And that marker was erected at West Court and West Streets at the house where she had lived when she attended Doylestown High School. Last year, in September, the Society was delighted to put on a program to honor the life and work of Wilma Brown Reeser, and the Society reprinted in its original format her handwritten historical account of Doylestown, Doylestown and how it came to be, 1724 to 1980. And the reprint was made possible through a generous grant from Buyer's Choice Limited. So that brings us up to date, and without more, let's go to George and Vicki.
Well, thank you, Ed, for that nice introduction, and thank you, George Bishop, for agreeing to this interview. I understand you have many wonderful recollections to share with us. I hear you're a great storyteller, so you're going to have a nice opportunity to do that. Starting with 1910, when you were born in Blooming Glen, let's hear some of your family background.
Well, I was born December the 30th, 1910, and lived in the town for 5 years. And my grandfather had with his brother, had the Bishop Brothers General Store, and my dad worked in the store. and his cousin also worked in the store, so it was sort of a family affair. My granddad was he also served as a member of the board of directors of the Sellersville National Bank, and he would drive over to Sellersville once a week to the bank and take along deposits from various customers who lived in the Blooming Glen area. They'd bring the deposits down, and he'd take them over for them, because it was all horse and wagon, and it took quite a little while. So he did that service for the bank, and he's also at one time a postmaster of Blooming Glen, so he was quite a well-known figure in town.
What took you to Doylestown?
Well, Dad was afraid that his cousin working together would not be too good because of the family connection, and it might be a little bit of jealousy or so forth. So he says, better just get out from under the family business and start his own business. So he moved to 1915, moved to Doylestown, and in the meantime, he had constructed at 133 Harvey Avenue a large brick home and a big barn, and about 5 empty lots going down from Harvey Avenue to Union Street. And
The house is still standing?
the house was built, and the contractor was David D. Nice, well-known builder in Doylestown in those days. And the house is still standing, housing the portion of the bark situation, which is for retarded adults. Been very successful there, I believe.
So your dad built this house with all the modern conveniences for your mother.
Right.
So you said she had gas and electric in the house?
Gas and electric and 2 bathrooms. So was all we knew until the day we moved out. Then it was a different story.
And you said you were raised as a Mennonite?
Yes, my grandparents and parents were both Mennonite and could speak Pennsylvania Dutch fluently, and we got used to the rules and regulations of the church. Every Sunday we were there twice a day on a Sunday, and just became a way of life. And we got along reasonably well, and with a few altercations, but nothing serious ever.
Well, I bet your mother was a fairly strict.
Yes, Mother, we would tell her that our friends were not Mennonites, and they were good friends of ours, but what was the matter with their church? Well, it said they were all right, but they always hinge on 1 or 2 points of theology that differed from her. But she was a dear soul, and we had a lot of fun.
Great.
5 kids.
One of the stories that you told me about earlier was when one of your neighbor's mothers talked her into letting her take you to the movies. You weren't allowed to go to the movies.
Yeah, we didn't ever go to the movies, but this one nice lady in our street was wanting to give a birthday party for her son. So she said, come up to the house and have a birthday party, and then we'll take you all to the movies. Well, I didn't want to say no to something like that, or my mother either, so we took advantage of her kindness and went up to I don't know if it was called a Strand Theater or not at that time. It was on the 2nd floor of the Leneby building, up those high steps and into the movies, and we saw the film Evangeline, and I'll never forget it. It was just a new world for me.
And this was a black and white silent film.
Black and white, and jumping all the time. You know, the film was just anything but steady. And Mary McNeely would play the piano all through the movie and change the mood of the music with the mood of the film. And she was an expert.
What do you remember about the town? There weren't many cars, I don't suppose.
No. The biggest number of cars that came to town were on Sundays to go to have dinner at the Doylestown Inn or the Fountain House. and they were known far and wide for their wonderful Sunday chicken dinners. And the Doylestown Inn was owned by the Hines family, and they had it for many, many years, and had a lovely, lovely hotel and inn.
George, in talking about the Doylestown Inn and the Fountain House, the various businesses, you mentioned that you knew the owner of the Fountain House?
Yeah, he's a very imposing gentleman with the name of Francis Maru. Why I ever remembered his name, I don't know, but he also rode a horse, and he bought the former Fanny Chapman estate, which incidentally bordered on 4 roads, 611, the Broad Street, Sandy Ridge Road, and the Dublin Pike. And that property could be bought after he died for $25,000 for the entire block where the Doylestown Shopping Center now is. Francis Maru owned the Fountain House, and he was also an avid collector of antiques. He furnished the Fountain House full of antiques, and his frequent visitor and friend was Henry Ford, who came in on buying trips to furnish his Dearborn Museum, which is a very well-known museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and he would buy antiques from Mr. Maru, and they became fast friends over the years.
But you still saw a lot of horses and carriages, buggies in town.
Oh, yes. The livery stable was right in back of Kenny's newsstand, and there you could hire horses on a carriage or just a buggy if you wanted a buggy, whatever you wanted. And it was always available. And in fact, all the houses in town, the big houses, all had barns to keep their horses and their carriages. Especially the big house on Court Street. They always ran back to the alley in where the horses were kept. Mm-hmm. And one of the memories I had of horse-drawn vehicles was the most remarkable was when Dad said one weekend, one was a Saturday or Sunday, he said, he's going to give us, the family, a treat. Take the entire family out in a 2-horse carriage out to the countryside, which he did, and we had a great time. Of course, there weren't that many cars on the road, so we had no problem getting around. And
wow.
The one thing I remember about the horse-drawn wagon was the horse had a big load in a express type of a wagon. It was just a 1-horse wagon, but it was a pretty big load. And he's coming up Main Street, right near Maxwell's restaurant, and he slipped and fell. And of course, you know, when a horse falls and breaks his leg, that's curtains for him. So they called the chief of police out, and he shot him right on the spot. And then they called the fertilizer company, Dugan's Fertilizer Company, and they sent out a 2-horse team with what I call a dump wagon, and they winched him up in a wagon and took him out to the factory.
Pretty exciting stuff for a young man in town, huh?
That scared me when I saw that horse groveling around on the street trying to get up, and no way could he get up. So that's one of the vignettes I remember.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you first came to town, your father bought a business from a Tobias Shelley?
Shelley, yes. And he was the grandfather of Mrs. Milton Rutherford. And so our family used to go to the shore together, and we had quite a bit of contact with them. And what he did was to go through the countryside from Doylestown to Carversville and collect produce from the farms, and eggs especially, and poultry. And
in a horse and carriage. In
a horse and wagon, and in the wintertime with a 2-horse bobsled. And it was, the business grew so much that at one time in one summer he had stopped at 63 farms for the week, to collect these things, and then they were shipped on by trolley freight to Philadelphia.
From Doylestown.
From Doylestown, yeah. We had very good travel connections between trolleys and train, and better than we do today, actually, yes.
Any memories of World War I? You mentioned something about rationing and...
Oh, yes. I'd run up to the store from Mother. The Hellier's grocery store was where the Veterans Building is, a former library there on Shule Avenue, and get 1 pound of sugar. We were allowed, I don't know whether it was once a month or some small amount, and then Company D had its armory, as you know, on Shule Avenue, and they at World War I, the recruits came in from the countryside and all over, and they gave them instructions at the armory and had them march, practice marching up and down Shule Avenue. These, you know, a couple hundred men. It was really quite awe-inspiring as a young kid to see that. And my dad had, at that time, he bought his first truck, which was a Hahn, H-A-H-N. And they now still make fire equipment. And in order to have truck service, we had to depend on outside mechanics. We had a young man in town by the name of Warren Freiling. And Warren would come over occasionally and do whatever was necessary to the truck. And as a kid, I would be close by and engage him in conversation and so forth. Then the war came, and Warren was drafted. And he went over, and we didn't hear from him for a long, long time. We finally found out he had been shot on the fields of France and in action. So that really impressed me to know someone and see him no more. And his family members are still living in Doylestown. A very fine family.
And you attended grade school in town at the...
Oh yes, started first grade and went, with the interruptions, I went to, ended up coming back and finishing high school there. And
Well, tell me about your move to the farm. First you went to the Sandy Ridge School, right?
oh yeah, so we moved to the farm. I was in Doylestown Township, and then you had to go to the schools in which we lived. And so we went to Sandy Ridge School, which at that time had a 3-year high school besides all the elementary grades, and it's still standing, very substantial brick building. And we had some very fine teachers there, excellent teachers, and gave us an inspiration for poetry, even things like that in the upper grades. So then we had a problem with one of the teachers. We got a new teacher, and he wasn't able to keep order. So the kids were running the school rather than the teacher, and Dad found out about it, and he said, "That's no place for you." He says, "I'll pay tuition for you to go to Doylestown Borough School." I forget how much a month it cost. It wasn't that much, really. So I went there in the 8th grade and got to know the kids, and it made the transition to high school a lot simpler. And
Let's backtrack for a moment. You mentioned moving to the farm.
Yes.
That was 1920, 1921?
21.
And where's the farm?
It's used to be the intersection of Old Dublin Pike, or 313 it's known today, and it was originally Old Dublin Pike. It's now closed off because of the development there. They just filled up that big gap in the highway, and it's right on sits on top of the hill, 1 mile from Connie's former restaurant.
Tell us about the farm. You said it was an 82-acre property.
82 acres.
In very bad disrepair, you had mentioned.
Yes.
And how did your father go about correcting that?
He took one look at it, and he thought it had potential, which it did. He had 40 acres on the Plumstead Township side of the Dublin Pike, and 42 acres on the Doylestown Township area.
And you moved from this wonderful new house in the borough to an
nothing.
old rundown farm with no electricity, you told
The
me.
only thing was good foundation, had 2-foot walls from the basement to the attic and spiral stairways from the basement to the attic on each end of the house. And I tell you, it never shook when the storms came. It was solid. And so Mother had to put up with the type of, and she made do until we finally got things in shape. Had to spend a mint of money modernizing, but in the meantime, she had to live through those agonizing days of 5 kids and 2 hired men and making meals. It was a real chore. However, she lived to be 98, so
you mentioned a real treat for her was that your father would send the laundry into town for ironing. That sounds like a great
well,
service.
those days there was no electric iron. You put it, well, I guess there was towards the end, but at the beginning you put the iron on the stove, and we had a wood-burning stove. You get up to make breakfast, you had to start the fire in the stove first. And but she always had the 2 baskets of clothing, iron clothing, to go down to a lady in Doylestown who would iron them. I think it was about $3 for the whole. A lot of clothes. At least that relieved her of a lot of work.
You also mentioned something very interesting about the renovation process when your father was dealing with the contractor.
Oh yes, at those days there was no thought of restoring anything to the olden days. It just wasn't heard of, except most with the affluent people. And Dad was trying to modernize, tore out 2 walk-in fireplaces to get start with, and then he was going to take out the chair rail in the living room. And then the contractor did say to him, he said, "Walter, I'm just putting one in for Mrs. Burkby. Don't you think you should consider that, reconsider it?" And Dad thought, yes, maybe it would be a good idea, so he didn't touch the chair rail, and it's there to this day. And so we learned, to our sorrow, how many mistakes you can make if you want to restore an old farmhouse.
You mentioned an old cemetery at the farm.
Yes, right across the road from the driveway was a 1-acre cemetery, and built and constructed, well, there wasn't much construction, but laid out by a man by the name of Abraham Fried back in the early 1800s. And he's buried there with his German inscription on his tombstone. And then the oldest one is a man, Wharton, his name was. He died in 1769. And then another man, the name on the gravestone says, William Davis, a black man. Black and white as you pass by, remember you too must die. Very pertinent words, to say the least. And so that's been there, and it was very much in disrepair when we moved there, and nobody had done anything for years. So a lot of just plain stones with just 2 initials on it, or the date, just depended. And it's written up in George McReynolds' book, Place Names in Bucks County, if you'd like further information on that.
That's great. And there were 5 children. Did you all have certain assignments on the farm to help your father?
Yes, my sister was 2 years older. She had to help Mother serve dinners and help her around the house. And we boys, I got drafted into milking. My father could never milk, never learned it, and I was sort of challenged because the hired men can do it. So I said, well, I could do it too, and I did. And they finally got me hooked up to do it regularly, which I didn't appreciate, especially on Sundays. So, but it never hurt me to any extent. Yes.
Helped get you ready for high school. Well, you started high school in what, about 1924?
24 is about right, yes.
Doylestown High?
Doylestown High. We had a wonderful school and a high academic record. We had Dr. Carmen Ross as our principal, and he maintained a very fine roster of teachers. We got many awards, our faculty did, for teaching. He was a strict disciplinarian. We wore coats and ties all year till school was over. That's all we knew, and everybody obeyed it, no problem. And I did meet Jim Michener as a student. He was a senior, and I was a sophomore or freshman, I forget which. And he was always a great athlete and a fine student. And he spent a lot of his time out in the hallway sharpening his pencil. He'd always tell the principal that, at least. And but the fact was, he was just bored with the routine of classes. He wanted to expand himself and intellectually. And Miss Lamb, the principal, was a graduate of Swarthmore, and she saw his potential, and she saw to it, one way or another, he got to Swarthmore, which he did, and as you know, the rest of the story.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a little bit of mischief that he got into.
Oh, yes, there were
school.
practical jokes those days. Nothing that was desecrated anything, but it's just a good joke. And we had the big assembly room in the high school where all the seniors sat. And one morning we came into the assembly room, and prior to that there was the bus of famous figures of history, music, and Shakespeare, and for arts, and different figures. And they were just on stands about halfway up the side of the walls, about 6 of them around the room. And we got in there Monday morning, here all these busts had a collection of German helmets on their heads, which were in the display case out in the hall. That was after World War I, and they were vestiges of the war. So everybody was dumbstruck, but I don't think the boys got meted out a very harsh punishment. It was Jim Michener and Eggs Hayman, as he was known, and we all had a good laugh about it.
Right. And for our viewers, Eggs Hayman was Dorothy Redfield's brother.
That's right. Very good.
And I think you told me the first football team started during your tenure at Doylestown High?
We were just on the brink of getting things started, and we got the director of athletics, Bill Wolf, who later, in off season, was the instructor of the Doylestown Fanny Chapman Pool, and he started the football team in 1928, I think. And then also we had a good music teacher, and she started the orchestra. And then we came into bands. Professor, they call him Professor Delano from Lansdale, had a wonderful band in Lansdale, and they said, why couldn't we have a band too? So that started around 26. We have a orchestra and a band, and from then on it's history. I mean, it was just the beginning in those days. Yeah.
You mentioned something else that you enjoyed very much, the Chautauqua. Tell us about that.
Yes, well that was when we were still in Doylestown. Every summer the Chautauqua circuit would have come around and pitched tent on Union Street between Broad and Shule Avenue. It's a big empty lot. And the circuit would send college-age boys and girls, and also a director, and they'd conduct the facilities, see that everything was, the huge tent was erected and everything set up. And in the mornings they'd have the kids of the town come in, and they'd put him through all kinds of gymnastic exercises and entertain them. And in the evening we'd have very cultural lectures and music programs of various kinds. It comes to mind now Swiss bell ringers from Switzerland, and the famous speaker, Russell Conwell, who was a founder and president of Temple University, was a Baptist minister, and he always had a favorite lecture called Acres of Diamonds, of which you can still buy his book. It's a little booklet. And but he said the night, when I heard him, he said, "I'm not going to speak on my favorite topic, but I have a new one called Great Acquaintances I Have Known." And they proceeded to tell about the various men of note who he knew and met over his lifetime. And he was comparing to the Billy Graham of today. That's the way he had an entree into almost every place he'd want to go. And one of them was to the White House to shake hands with President Lincoln. So our history dates back through the past generation, and it was a wonderful week in August generally when the Chautauqua would come to town. Mm-hmm. So we really enjoyed it.
You also mentioned the Burton Holmes travelogue.
Oh yes, the high school. Dr. Ross was very conscious of wanting to give us the best of culture as possible. And of course that was possible because of our proximity to Philadelphia. And he got Mr. Holmes, we called the Burton Holmes travelogues, which appeared all over the country, and had them up in our high school. And one Friday afternoon, he was able to get Nelson Eddy of movie fame to come up and give us a concert. And it was just delightful. And somehow I heard that they paid him $35 for the concert, but it was well remembered.
George, tell me about your recollections of the Mercer family.
Well, it was, we were very fortunate having people of that stature living in our neighborhood, and just a little over 1.5 miles away. Mr. Willie, as he was called to his friends, would come out every year to collect money for the Red Cross. And he'd ride his white stallion out in the countryside, and he was quite an impressive figure going around. And then he's had quite noted for their cultural endeavors and the entertainment, like the Trapp Family Singers, and later on the disciple of modern dance called Isadora Duncan. I think she was from Europe, I believe, and she came over and put on a program
here at Aldi.
All day out in the sheep pasture right next to the loggia, and they put a canvas tent around it, so that I snuck in somehow and saw the performance. And she was a forerunner of the modern dance in this country, and Mercer's sponsored her.
Did your parents know you did that?
No, that was a deep secret. I was not supposed to be there, but I made it anyway. So just one of those childhood pranks that you do.
I'll bet she left quite an impression.
And with interest, I read about her later on, and that's where she started here.
And the Mercers really made many contributions to the community.
Yes, the best thing, we had the first municipal swimming pool in the area. Fanny Chapman Pool, given by Willie Mercer in memory of his aunt, Fanny Chapman, that lived across the street from Aldi. And Mr. and Mrs. Mercer would go down, we'd see her down there sitting under an umbrella with her town friends, Mrs. Clymer, Mrs. Burtby, and people in the area, enjoying seeing the kids having a lot of fun at the pool. So it was a beautiful sight.
And William Mercer's brother, Henry.
Oh, Henry, yes. Well, Willie and Henry didn't get along that famously. I think there was a little rivalry there. Both were artists in their own right, but Henry went more into the collection of, as he calls it, the tools of the nation builder. And with a wonderful museum he built. And in order to get a lot of those local items of interest, he got friendly with a well-known Mennonite minister by the name of Reverend David Gaiman. Now, Reverend Gaiman could speak High German and Pennsylvania Dutch, and of course fluent in English. But what Mercer did was to take David Gaiman with him on his buying trips throughout the countryside. And he, in order to gain entrance, he would send the Reverend in first, introduce himself, and tell them in German or Pennsylvania Dutch that this Mercer was an okay man, you could trust him, and tell him that he wanted to buy some of the items they were probably going to throw away anyway. And that's how he started in the Bucks County area to get a lot of his items that he entered into the collection.
Mm-hmm.
So they were, and we'd see him driving around in an open touring car, the Mennonite minister and Willie Mercer, not Willie Mercer, Henry Mercer, sitting side by side in the open touring with a chauffeur-driven touring car. It was quite a sight.
Quite a sight. Well, you finished high school in 28, you worked on the farm for a couple of years, and then you left for college,
Yes,
right about the time the Depression began.
Yes, in 30. And on the farm you didn't know there was a Depression because it took that many years for it to filter down to the man who produced the grains and so forth. In other areas we felt right away. And so I went to Goshen College in Goshen, Indiana, where my sister had been, and I went there for 2 years, and ready to enter my third when the Depression really hit home, and Dad was hurting financially, and the banker called up and said he had a loan. He said he'd have to have more money for collateral, as the collateral didn't exceed the loan. The loan was greater than the collateral. The stock market had dropped that badly, especially bank stocks, which my dad had. So I decided to stay home. He said he'd made me all kinds of promises, which I don't remember whether they were fulfilled or not, but he meant well. Anyway, so I came home and ran the farm and for Dad, and helped out whichever I could. And Dad had started out with no knowledge of farming, but he took the advice of Penn State and the Farm Bureau and the county agent who introduced him to scientific farming. And that was the end, or the salvation for his success in farming. And he was put on the board of the farm group on the Delaware Valley College, or National Farm School as it was called in those days. And he was giving their annual report from his angle at a hotel in Philadelphia when he was stricken with a heart attack, and he died about 4 months later.
So you took over the farm and the family, and
Yes, and provided a home for my mother until she got squared away, and then she moved to an apartment in Doylestown and stayed there until she went into a retirement home. So she was well taken care of. Yeah.
And you met your sweetheart when you were away at college?
Yes. By accident, sort of, I saw her singing in the choir, and I was just enamored with her ability her singing ability and looks. And I asked my sister if she would introduce me to her, which she did, and said she had a steady boyfriend, but I said I still want to meet her. And so the afternoon we got together, and I asked her for a date. She said no, she had a date for the evening. But she said, I'm not doing anything this afternoon. She wanted to be kind to my sister. So I said, okay, let's go. And went out through the countryside, and we went to a big gladiola farm out there, acres and acres of gladiolas. And then we came to the Goshen airport, and I said, how about going up for a ride? They had a sign of $1 per ride. So we did that, and it literally swept her off her feet. So we had a great time, and got together. That was the middle of summer. In the end of the summer, through my ex-brother-in-law, he arranged a house party in Point Pleasant. And it was all right for my girlfriend to come if they had a chaperone. So my grandmother, who was very spry at the time and had a lot of fun, volunteered to be house mother for 6 couples in that old house on Point Pleasant. So we had a great time, to say the least, and we see each other during the summer, in the future years, and Christmas. Twice a year we see each other, and we carried on that friendship for 8 years. And in the meantime, writing numerous letters with 2-cent stamps, never using long-distance telephone.
And all the while you were managing the farm. And
yes, and taking care of the business full-time, and just take the train out to Chicago and to meet her up there, her sister's place in Chicago in wintertime. So, but life was really miserable. No one had any money. She had to teach school to pay back her college debt, so she taught country school out there in Illinois for a meager salary. And
after 8 years of romancing, she became your bride.
I wore her down, actually, yes.
And she moved out here and lived on the farm?
Moved out here and moved in our dad's tenant house, which is a nice little 2-story bungalow. And there we started out. And then after my father died, we moved down to the big house, and I bought the farm a few years after that. So.
Let's go back to Doylestown. You married in 1936. So things were changing, starting to recover from the Depression. The war was in the offing, a few years away yet. What was it like in town? Was the livery stable gone?
Livery stable was gone, and things were starting to spruce up. Joe Kenny and his group had a program called like Operation Bootstrap, something like that, and all the business people should invest money in their places of business and renovate and modernize the appearance of downtown Doylestown, which they certainly did, and did a good job of it, and throughout the town. And State Street was made a one-way street instead of a two-way street. And
it's hard for me to imagine State Street as a two-way street.
And parking besides. But there was no hurry. Everybody had plenty of time to get around. But the town itself was starting to look really up to date, and the horses were gone, and it was just up to date town, and it remained so ever since.
And then World War II came.
Yes, that was the time when everybody was being drafted, and I was being drafted, and except I had 3 children, or we did rather, and so I was deferred, and then since I was running the farm, they thought that was important too, and so that was, I was put on deferment. However, I did help with the Red Cross program, life-saving and all the aspects of Red Cross disaster work, and also an air raid warden in Doylestown Township.
And what did an air raid warden in Doylestown
Well,
do?
we had blackouts every so many nights. I forget what frequency they were, but when the blackout was called, you were not supposed to see any light coming out from anyone's house. You had to buy a black curtain and close it tightly, and the automobile lights had to be extinguished for a certain period of time on the road, and I had to stop the traffic and have them turn out the lights, and I forget how long we had to stay that way until they were given the all clear signal. Then we were allowed to proceed on the highway again. But it was quite an experience, to say the least.
Must have been. Speaking of the roadways, I'm sure I have my times mixed up. This was probably several years earlier, but you mentioned toll gates, which fascinated me. Right
Yes.
in and about.
Well, it was only regarding to the Dublin Pike, and that had to be financed. And they started in 1797, the Dublin Pike, and had their first toll gate across the street from Pine Run Road, where the Penn Color is. That was the first one from Doylestown. The next one was at Fountainville, and the next one was at Apple Butter Road and Dublin Pike before you get into Dublin. And that route was called Dublin Pike, and it also had a mail route called the Dublin Stage. And they had run a horse and wagon first, and then a car. And if you wanted to go from Doylestown to Dublin, they had to take you on that route. Of course, you'd have to stop and leave off mail every so often. But that was financed by these people who agreed to serve as toll gate keepers. And they built, the houses were built right close to the road, and a little porch in the front. And as horse and wagon came through, they would have a big cup at the end of a long pole and push it out in front to the driver to put in a couple pennies of toll which was due them. And they had to agree for the house and a place for a garden, and $7 a month was their pay. And they had drawn up a strict agreement, and that's still available down at the historical building. And so that was the end. That, I think, was in 1918 or something like that, that was discontinued, the toll gate. There's one still standing, incidentally, on the Hilltown Pike. Before you get to Blooming Glen, if you want to look at that, it's right on the road, on the right-hand side going west on the Route 113. Yeah.
So the war came and went. When we get into the 50s and 60s, you were probably seeing a huge amount of development going on in the area, and many, many people moving into town.
Yeah. The first wave came in as far as development, not development actually, but restoration, I would say, was the automobile group came in from General Motors, and some of these men had ties to Doylestown, and they knew what country life was. What they do is buy these farms for a song out through Buckingham, Salisbury, and Doylestown, and fix them up terrifically beautiful. And then they'd hire a farmer to come in and farm them for them to keep the weeds down and so forth. And they did that as a hobby. So that General Motors group was in for a good many years. Before the next wave came, it was the theatrical group from New York, Broadway, and the composers and so forth. And that was another, gave it a lot of importance to Doylestown and environs. Mm-hmm. Very well known, well, you know the well-known actors and actresses who came, and the New Hope group. Mm-hmm. So that was an impetus to the further growth of Bucks County.
You've seen a lot of changes in Doylestown. How would you summarize the last, 83 years that you've lived in town?
Well, We had no radio, TV, or anything else. And my mother said she came from nothing, and that was even more remote than we were. But in the Doylestown area was a wonderful place to be living and to raise children, and culturally and scholastically it's a wonderful environment, and it still is today. The people take pride in their properties, and it's a lovely town.
Thank you, George. I'm Vicki Azar interviewing George Bishop. Doylestown since 1910, the evolution of a small, wonderful town. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki.
It was very nice.